Sometimes a single moment can shatter everything you thought you knew about your life. For Maya Chen, that moment came not with fanfare or warning, but with the quiet click of a credit card machine and 3 words that would change her world forever. She was 26 years old, working double shifts at an upscale restaurant, drowning in student debt, and living paycheck to paycheck in a cramped studio apartment. He was Marcus Whitfield, a man whose name appeared on Forbes lists and whose casual Tuesday lunch cost more than she made in a week. Their worlds should never have collided. But when they did, it set in motion a chain of events that would expose secrets buried for decades, unravel a web of corporate conspiracy, and prove that sometimes the most ordinary people hold the keys to extraordinary truths. This isn't a fairy tale about a wealthy benefactor swooping in to save the day. This is the story of how a wrongful termination, a mysterious black card, and one waitress's refusal to stay silent brought down one of the most powerful restaurant empires in the country. What started as a simple act of kindness became a battle for justice that would test everything Maya believed about right and wrong, loyalty and betrayal, and the price of standing up to power. The morning fog hung thick over downtown Seattle as Maya Chen hurried through the glass doors of Meridian, one of the city's most exclusive restaurants. At 26, she moved with the practiced efficiency of someone who had learned to navigate the demanding world of fine dining service. Her black uniform was pressed to perfection, her dark hair pulled back in the regulation low bun, and her smile was ready despite the exhaustion that seemed to live permanently behind her eyes. Meridian wasn't just any restaurant. It was the flagship location of the Whitfield Restaurant Group, a dining empire that stretched across 12 states and generated hundreds of millions in revenue annually. The clientele included tech executives, politicians, celebrities, and old money families whose names graced building foundations and charity galas. Working here was considered a privilege in the industry, and Maya had fought hard to earn her position. She had been at Meridian for 18 months, working her way up from a weekend hostess to a full server in the main dining room. The tips were excellent, the atmosphere was refined, and the experience looked impressive on her resume. But beneath the polished surface, Maya had begun to notice things that didn't sit right with her. Small inconsistencies in how certain customers were treated, whispered conversations that stopped when she approached, and a general atmosphere of secrecy that seemed to permeate the management level. The lunch rush was beginning to build when Maya was assigned to table 12, a corner booth with a perfect view of the bustling street below. She approached with her standard greeting, notepad ready, but paused when she saw the man sitting alone. He was impeccably dressed in a charcoal suit that probably cost more than her monthly rent. His salt and pepper hair perfectly styled, and his attention focused on a stack of documents spread across the white tablecloth. Marcus Whitfield was a name that carried weight in Seattle and beyond. At 52, he had built his restaurant empire from a single food truck into a multi-hundred-million-dollar operation that employed thousands of people. His face appeared regularly in business magazines, and his opinions on industry trends were quoted by financial reporters. He was known for his sharp business acumen, his demanding perfectionist standards, and his ability to spot trends before they became mainstream. "Good afternoon, Mr. Whitfield," Maya said, her professional demeanor intact despite the slight flutter of nervousness in her stomach. "Welcome to Meridian. Can I start you with something to drink?" Marcus looked up from his papers, his piercing blue eyes taking in her appearance with the kind of analytical assessment that made her feel like she was being evaluated for more than just her service skills. "Just coffee, black," he said, his voice carrying the quiet authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question. Maya nodded and moved toward the coffee station, but something about the interaction felt different from her usual celebrity encounters. There was an intensity to his gaze, a calculating quality that made her wonder if this was just a routine business lunch or something more significant. When she returned with the coffee, Marcus had cleared away most of his documents except for one manila folder that remained open beside his plate. She caught a glimpse of what appeared to be financial reports and employee records before he casually closed it. "Are you ready to order, sir?" she asked, refilling his water glass with practiced precision. "The salmon, prepared however your chef recommends it," Marcus replied, his attention seemingly focused on his phone. But as Maya turned to leave, his voice stopped her. "Miss Chen, isn't it?" She turned back, surprised that he knew her name. The restaurant had over 40 servers, and while he occasionally dined at his own establishments, she had never served him before. "Yes, sir," she confirmed, wondering how he had identified her so quickly. "You have been here about 18 months, Marcus continued, looking at her with his full attention. "Previously worked at the Harbour Club downtown. Graduated from University of Washington with a degree in journalism. Currently working toward paying off approximately $47,000 in student loans." Maya felt the colour drain from her face. The information, casual recitation of her personal, delivered in the same tone he might use to order wine, was deeply unsettling. "How do you know all that? How do you?" she asked, her professional composure beginning to crack. "I make it my business to know about the people who work for me," Marcus replied with a slight smile that didn't reach his eyes, "especially the ones who ask questions." The comment hit Maya like a physical blow. Over the past few months, she had indeed been asking questions. Nothing dramatic or confrontational, but she had begun to notice patterns that concerned her. Certain VIP customers seemed to receive services that went beyond exceptional hospitality. Private dining rooms were sometimes reserved for meetings that appeared more political than social, and there were financial irregularities in the reservation system that didn't make sense for a legitimate business operation. She had mentioned some of these observations to a few co-workers, thinking they were just curious anomalies. Apparently, those conversations had made their way up the chain of command to the very top. "I'm not sure what you mean, Mr. Whitfield," Maya said carefully, acutely aware that this conversation could determine her continued employment. Marcus leaned back in his chair, studying her with the same intensity she had noticed earlier. "You're intelligent, observant, and you have a background in investigative journalism. Those are admirable qualities in many professions. In this particular environment, they can be problematic." The implication was clear, but Maya felt a spark of defiance rising in her chest. She had worked too hard to get where she was to be intimidated by vague threats, even from someone as powerful as Marcus Whitfield. "I take pride in doing my job well," she said, her voice steady despite the rapid beating of her heart. "If being observant and asking questions about how to better serve our guests is problematic, then perhaps the problem isn't with the questions." For a moment, something that might have been respect flickered across Marcus's features. Then it was gone, replaced by the cold calculation she was beginning to recognize as his default expression. "Bring me the check," he said, returning his attention to his phone. "And tell Manager Richardson I'd like to speak with him before I leave." Maya's stomach dropped. A private conversation between the owner and her manager, especially after the exchange they had just had, could only mean one thing. She brought the check with hands that trembled slightly, and Marcus signed it without looking at the total. He left a tip that was exactly 15%, calculated to the penny, neither generous nor stingy, just precisely average. As she processed the payment, Maya noticed something odd. Instead of using a standard credit card, Marcus had paid with a sleek black card that looked unlike anything she had seen before. It had no visible numbers, no bank logo, just a subtle geometric pattern etched into its surface. When she ran it through the machine, it processed immediately without requiring a signature or PIN. 20 minutes later, Maya was called into Manager Richardson's office. Richardson was a nervous man in his early 40s who had always treated her nicely, but this time he couldn't meet her eyes. "Maya, I'm sorry, but we're going to have to let you go," he said in a rush. "This is effective immediately. We'll provide 2 weeks severance pay and a neutral reference for future employment opportunities." The shock was like being plunged into ice water. What? Why? What did I do wrong? Richardson shuffled papers on his desk, clearly uncomfortable. "It's not about performance, it's a business decision. Corporate restructuring. We're eliminating several positions." Maya knew it was a lie. She had just served the man who made those corporate decisions, and his message had been crystal clear. Her questions, her observations, her refusal to simply accept what she saw without thinking about it, had made her a liability. "This is about my conversation with Mr. Whitfield, isn't it?" she pressed. "Because I noticed things that didn't add up." Richardson finally looked at her, and she saw something like pity in his eyes. Maya, take my advice. Don't pursue this. Take the severance, find another job, and move on with your life. Some battles aren't worth fighting. But as Maya cleaned out her locker and walked through the restaurant's gleaming dining room one last time, she felt a burning sense of injustice that no amount of practical advice could extinguish. She had been fired not for poor performance, not for genuine restructuring, but for asking questions, for being curious about irregularities that suggested something more serious than poor bookkeeping. As she stepped out onto the busy sidewalk, Maya realized that Marcus Whitfield had made a critical error in judgment. He had assumed that firing her would end her curiosity, that losing her job would make her retreat into silence. Instead, he had given her something far more dangerous than employment. He had given her time, motivation, and the absolute certainty that whatever was happening at Meridian was worth hiding. The black card had processed her termination payment just as smoothly as it had processed his lunch, but Maya couldn't shake the feeling that their story was far from over. Maya spent the next 3 days in her studio apartment, alternating between fury and despair. The severance check sat unopened on her kitchen counter, a reminder of how quickly her carefully constructed life had crumbled. She had called in sick to her weekend job at a coffee shop, unable to face the prospect of serving customers, while her mind churned with questions that had no answers. On Thursday morning, her phone rang. The caller ID showed a number she didn't recognize, but something compelled her to answer. "Miss Chen? This is David Park from the Seattle Tribune. I understand you recently worked at Meridian Restaurant, is that correct?" Maya's heart skipped. She had never contacted any reporters, never mentioned her situation to anyone outside her small circle of friends. "How did you get my number?" she asked nervously. "I make it my business to know when employees of certain establishments experience sudden career changes," David replied. His voice was calm, professional, but there was an underlying urgency that caught her attention. "I'd like to buy you coffee and discuss your recent experiences. There are others who have had similar situations." The meeting was set for a small cafe in Capitol Hill, far from the downtown restaurant district. Maya arrived early, choosing a corner table where she could see both entrances. She was nervous, unsure what she was walking into, but the prospect of answers outweighed her caution. David Park was younger than she had expected, maybe early 30s, with the kind of intense energy that suggested he lived on caffeine and deadlines. He carried a worn leather messenger with the slightly rumpled appearance of someone who spent more time chasing stories than worrying about his appearance. "Thank you for meeting me," he said, sliding into the seat across from her. "I know this must be difficult. Losing a job is never easy, especially under circumstances that feel unfair." Maya studied his face, looking for signs of deception or hidden agendas. "How do you know about my circumstances? And what did you mean about others?" David pulled a small digital recorder from his bag but didn't turn it on. Instead, he leaned forward, his voice dropping to just above a whisper. "For the past 8 months, I've been investigating irregularities in the Whitfield Restaurant Group's business practices. What started as a routine business story has uncovered patterns that suggest something much more significant." He opened a manila folder and spread several photographs across the table. They showed various Whitfield establishments, but the images focused on side entrances, service areas, and what appeared to be private dining rooms with covered windows. "These photos were taken at different locations over the past 6 months," David continued. "Notice anything unusual about the timing of certain deliveries and the types of vehicles involved?" Maya examined the images carefully. Several showed unmarked vans arriving at service entrances during off-peak hours. Others captured groups of men in expensive suits entering through side doors, avoiding the main dining areas entirely. "It looks like they're running private events that don't go through normal booking channels," Maya observed. "But that's not necessarily illegal. Lots of restaurants host private functions." "You're right," David agreed. "But when those private functions involve city council members, planning commissioners and developers who are bidding on major municipal contracts, and when those meetings happen consistently before major zoning decisions and permit approvals, it starts to look like something else entirely." The implications hit Maya like a physical weight. She thought about the conversations that had stopped when she approached the VIP customers who received unusual levels of attention, the financial irregularities she had noticed in the reservation system. "You think they're facilitating corruption?" she said, her voice barely audible. "I think Marcus Whitfield has built something much more valuable than a restaurant empire," David replied. "I think he's created a sophisticated network that provides neutral ground for transactions that can't happen in official government buildings or corporate boardrooms. The restaurants are legitimate businesses, but they also serve as venues where influence gets bought and sold." Maya felt pieces of a puzzle clicking into place. The black card that processed payments without standard verification procedures, the private dining rooms that were never listed on public reservation systems, the staff members who seemed to know which conversations to ignore and which customers required absolute discretion. "But if you suspect all this, why haven't you published the story?" David's expression grew frustrated, because suspicion isn't proof. "I have patterns, photographs of meetings and financial records that show unusual cash flows between the restaurant group and various shell companies. But I need someone on the inside who can provide documentation or first-hand testimony about how the system actually operates." He leaned back, studying her carefully. "You worked there for 18 months. You noticed things that made you ask questions that apparently made Marcus Whitfield nervous enough to have you fired personally. What did you see that he couldn't risk having you figure out?" Maya closed her eyes, thinking back through months of small observations that had seemed insignificant at the time. The reservation system had a secondary booking protocol that only certain managers could access. Some private dining rooms had specially modified point-of-sale terminals that processed payments differently. Certain regular customers never received printed receipts, and their orders were never logged in the standard system. There was a parallel operation, she realized aloud. Some customers were part of the regular restaurant business, but others were using the space for something entirely different. The staff was trained not to ask questions about the second group. David nodded, his eyes lighting up with the intensity of a reporter sensing a breakthrough. "That's exactly what I suspected. The restaurants provide perfect cover because they're legitimate businesses with normal operations. But layered on top of that is a secondary service that facilitates meetings and transactions that need to appear completely innocent." Maya felt a chill run down her spine as she understood the full implications of what they were discussing. If David was right, she hadn't just stumbled onto financial irregularities. She had discovered evidence of a systematic corruption network that potentially involved some of the most powerful people in the city. "What happened to the other employees who asked questions?" she asked, remembering David's earlier comment about others who had experienced similar situations. David's expression grew grim. Over the past 2 years, 17 employees across various Whitfield locations have been terminated for reasons that don't stand up to scrutiny. Most were servers, bartenders, or junior managers who had access to reservation systems and payment processing. All of them were terminated shortly after they began asking questions about irregularities they had observed. The pattern was clear and deeply disturbing. Marcus Whitfield wasn't just running restaurants. He was running a sophisticated operation that required absolute loyalty and unquestioning compliance from his staff. Anyone who showed signs of curiosity or independent thinking was eliminated before they could piece together the larger picture. Maya thought about Manager Richardson's parting advice to take the severance and move on with her life. He had known exactly what kind of organization he was working for, and he had tried to protect her the only way he could. But his warning had also contained an implicit threat. Some battles aren't worth fighting. "What are you asking me to do?" Maya asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. David leaned forward again, his voice intense, but not pressuring. "I'm asking you to help me expose what's really happening. Not for revenge against Marcus Whitfield, but because this kind of corruption undermines everything that democratic government is supposed to represent. When city contracts go to the highest bidder instead of the most qualified company, when zoning decisions get made based on private payments instead of public good, everyone in the city suffers." He pulled out a business card and placed it on the table between them. I'm not asking you to decide right now, but if you're willing to help, I can promise you that your story will be told accurately and that you'll have legal protection throughout the process. There are whistleblower statutes that apply to this kind of situation." Maya picked up the card, running her thumb over the raised lettering. David Park, investigative reporter, Seattle Tribune. It felt heavier than it should have, weighted with possibilities and consequences she couldn't fully predict. "What would helping you actually involve?" she asked. "Documentation," David replied. "Any records you might have kept from your time there, photos of the reservation systems, copies of unusual receipts, names and dates of suspicious meetings, and potentially testimony about what you observed and how the parallel operation functioned." Maya realized that she had been unconsciously preparing for this moment throughout her employment at Meridian. Her journalism background had trained her to notice details and inconsistencies, and she had instinctively documented things that seemed unusual. She had photos on her phone of reservation screens, notes about strange customer interactions, and detailed memories of conversations that had seemed significant at the time. "I need to think about this," she said, finally. "This isn't just about my career anymore. If you're right about what's happening, the people involved have enough power to make life very difficult for anyone who threatens them." David nodded, understanding the weight of what he was asking. "Take all the time you need, but remember that every day this continues, more contracts get awarded through corruption, more public decisions get bought and paid for, and more people suffer the consequences of a system that's been compromised." As Maya walked home through the drizzling Seattle afternoon, she felt the weight of an impossible choice settling on her shoulders. She could take Richardson's advice, accept the severance payment, find another job, and try to rebuild her life. Or she could step forward into a battle against one of the most powerful business empires in the region, knowing that the outcome was far from certain and the personal cost could be devastating. But as she climbed the stairs to her studio apartment, Maya realized that the choice had already been made. Marcus Whitfield had fired her not because she was a threat to his business, but because she represented something he couldn't control or compromise. She represented the possibility that someone might care more about truth than about personal comfort, more about justice than about job security. The black card had processed her termination, but it couldn't process her conscience. And Maya Chen was beginning to understand that her real work was just beginning. That evening, Maya sat cross-legged on her apartment floor, surrounded by a chaotic spread of documents, photographs, and handwritten notes she had accumulated during her 18 months at Meridian. What had started as casual observations in a small notebook had evolved into an extensive collection of evidence that painted a disturbing picture of systematic corruption. Her phone buzzed constantly with text messages from former co-workers expressing shock at her sudden termination. Each message reinforced her growing certainty that something was fundamentally wrong with the official story. Sarah from the evening shift wrote that management had announced Maya's departure as a voluntary resignation for personal reasons. Tom from the bar mentioned that all of Maya's shifts for the next 2 weeks had been immediately redistributed, as if they had been prepared for her absence well in advance. The most unsettling message came from Jessica, a server who had been hired just 2 weeks before Maya's termination. Marcus Whitfield had personally introduced himself to her during her orientation, something that never happened with new employees. He had specifically mentioned that the restaurant valued discretion and loyalty above all other qualities, and that employees who demonstrated those virtues would find their careers advancing rapidly within the organization. Maya spread out the photographs she had taken on her phone over the past several months. At the time, she had thought she was simply documenting interesting aspects of her workplace for a potential portfolio or future reference. Now, examined through the lens of David Park's investigation, each image told a more sinister story. There was a photo of the private dining room's modified payment terminal, which she had snapped because the interface looked different from the standard systems used in the main restaurant. The terminal had additional security features and processing options that weren't available on regular point-of-sale machines. Another image showed the reservation book for the private rooms, with entries that used coded abbreviations instead of actual names or company identifiers. Most revealing was a series of photos she had taken of the service entrance during what should have been slow periods. The images clearly showed unmarked vehicles arriving at precise intervals, often carrying individuals who entered through the service area and were escorted directly to private dining spaces without ever appearing in the main restaurant. These meetings occurred with clockwork regularity, always on specific days of the week, and always involving the same mysterious payment procedures. As Maya organized her documentation, she began to see patterns that she had missed while working inside the system. The corruption network wasn't random or opportunistic. It was methodical, sophisticated, and designed to appear completely legitimate to anyone who wasn't looking for irregularities. Marcus Whitfield had created a business model from both traditional restaurant operations and from that generated revenue, providing secure, discrete venues for transactions that needed to remain invisible to public scrutiny. Her laptop chimed with an email notification. The sender was listed as M. Whitfield, and the subject line simply read, "Final consideration." Maya's hands trembled as she opened the message. "Miss Chen." The email began in the same formal tone Marcus had used during their face-to-face conversation. "I hope you are using this transition period to reflect on your future career goals and the importance of professional discretion in the hospitality industry. I wanted to reach out personally to ensure you understand the complete terms of your severance agreement." The email continued with language that sounded like legal boilerplate but carried unmistakable undertones of threat. The severance payment was contingent on her agreement to a comprehensive non-disclosure clause that would prevent her from discussing any aspect of her employment at Meridian. More significantly, the agreement included a non-disparagement provision that would legally prohibit her from making any statements that could be construed as harmful to the reputation of the Whitfield Restaurant Group or any of its associates. The final paragraph was the most chilling. The email noted that the restaurant industry in Seattle was relatively small and that word traveled quickly among employers about former employees who failed to maintain appropriate professional boundaries after their departure. Maya understood the implication perfectly. If she refused to sign the agreement, or if she caused problems for the organization, her ability to find employment anywhere in the city's service industry would be effectively eliminated. Attached to the email was a formal contract that would legally bind her to silence in exchange for the severance payment she desperately needed. The document was professionally prepared and clearly written by attorneys who specialized in protecting corporate interests. Every clause was designed to ensure that Maya would have no legal recourse if she decided to speak publicly about her experiences. Maya stared at the contract for nearly an hour, weighing her options with the cold calculation of someone whose life had been reduced to a series of impossible choices. Signing the agreement would provide her with enough money to survive for several weeks while she searched for new employment. Refusing to sign would leave her financially desperate but legally free to cooperate with David Park's investigation. The choice became clearer when she considered the broader implications of her situation. Marcus Whitfield was offering her money to disappear quietly, but he was also demonstrating the reach of his influence and his willingness to use it against anyone who threatened his operation. The fact that he had personally sent the email rather than having it come from human resources or legal counsel suggested that he viewed her as a significant enough threat to warrant his direct attention. Maya picked up David Park's business card and dialed his number. He answered on the second ring, his voice alert despite the late hour. "David, this is Maya Chen. I've made my decision. I want to help with your investigation." There was a brief pause, then David's voice came back with barely controlled excitement. "That's excellent news, Maya. What changed your mind?" "I just received an email from Marcus Whitfield with a severance agreement that's essentially hush money. He's not just trying to buy my silence, he's threatening my entire future in this industry if I don't comply." "Can you forward me that email?" David asked. That kind of direct intimidation could be valuable evidence of consciousness of guilt. It shows he knows there's something worth hiding. Maya hit the forward button as they spoke. "Already sent. David, I need to know what I'm getting into here. As we go forward with this, what kind of protection can you actually provide?" David's tone became more serious. "I work with attorneys who specialize in whistleblower cases. They can provide legal representation throughout the process and help ensure that any retaliation against you is documented and actionable. The Tribune also has resources for source protection, and we've successfully handled similar cases in the past. He paused, then continued with complete honesty. But I won't lie to you, Maya. This is going to be difficult. Marcus Whitfield has significant resources and political connections. He's going to fight back, and he's going to try to discredit both you and the investigation. You need to be prepared for that. Maya looked around her small apartment, taking in the modest furnishings and the stack of unpaid bills on her counter. She had already lost her job and her financial security. The question now was whether she would also lose her integrity and her chance to make a meaningful difference. I understand the risks, she said finally, but I also understand that staying silent makes me complicit in whatever's happening. I can't live with that. David's voice carried a note of respect that hadn't been there before. All right then, let's meet tomorrow morning. I want to go through all of your documentation systematically and start building a comprehensive case. And Maya, thank you. What you're doing takes real courage. After ending the call, Maya felt a strange sense of relief mixed with apprehension. She had crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed, committed herself to a path that would almost certainly make her life more complicated and potentially more dangerous. But she had also reclaimed something that Marcus Whitfield's intimidation tactics had tried to take from her. She had reclaimed her agency and her right to make choices based on her own moral compass rather than on fear of consequences. Maya spent the rest of the evening organising her documentation into categories that would be useful for David's investigation. Financial irregularities, unusual customer interactions, procedural anomalies, and staff behaviour patterns. Each category painted part of a larger picture that was becoming increasingly clear and increasingly damning. The black card that Marcus had used to pay for his lunch wasn't just an unusual payment method. It was a symbol of a parallel financial system that operated outside normal banking regulations and oversight procedures. The private dining rooms weren't just exclusive spaces for wealthy customers. They were carefully designed environments where illegal transactions could be conducted with complete privacy and minimal documentation. Most importantly, Maya's termination wasn't just about eliminating a curious employee. It was about protecting a sophisticated criminal enterprise that had embedded itself so deeply within Seattle's legitimate business community that it had become nearly invisible to outside scrutiny. As Maya prepared for bed, she realized that her real education in investigative journalism was just beginning. Tomorrow, she would start the process of learning how to transform observations and suspicions into actionable evidence. She would discover what it meant to challenge power structures that seemed untouchable and to pursue truth in the face of overwhelming opposition. The severance agreement sat unsigned on her kitchen counter, a reminder of the road not taken. Maya had chosen justice over security, principle over pragmatism. Now she had to prove that choice had been worth making. Her phone buzzed one final time before she fell asleep. Another message from Marcus Whitfield, this one containing just 4 words that carried the weight of absolute certainty. "You will regret this." She took it as another piece of evidence that she was doing the right thing. Marcus Whitfield had built his empire on the assumption that everyone had a price, and that fear was more powerful than conscience. Tomorrow morning, she would begin the process of proving him wrong. The rain continued to fall against her apartment windows, washing the city clean while Maya Chen prepared to expose the corruption that had been hidden beneath Seattle's polished surface for far too long. She had been fired for asking questions, but her real work was just beginning. The next morning arrived grey and drizzling, typical Seattle weather that seemed to match Maya's mood as she prepared for what felt like the most important meeting of her life. She dressed carefully in professional attire, wanting to project competence and credibility, despite the turmoil of the past few days. Her documentation was organised in a leather portfolio that had been a graduation gift from her parents, a reminder of the journalism career she had abandoned for the financial security of restaurant work. David Park had chosen a different location for their second meeting, a quiet bookstore cafe in the Fremont neighborhood that was far removed from both the downtown business district and the areas where Whitfield Restaurant Group operated. When Maya arrived, she found him already seated at a corner table with a laptop open and several legal pads covered in handwritten notes spread across the surface. He looked up as she approached, and she could see the intensity of someone who had spent the night diving deep into research. "Maya, thank you for coming. I've been reviewing the email you forwarded, and I've also been making some calls to sources within the city government. What we're looking at is potentially much bigger than I initially suspected." Maya settled into the chair across from him, placing her portfolio on the table. "How much bigger?" David turned his laptop screen toward her, revealing a complex diagram that looked like a spider web of connections between various entities. He had been busy creating a visual map of relationships between the Whitfield Restaurant Group, city officials, development companies, and a network of shell corporations that seemed to exist solely to facilitate financial transactions between the other parties. Over the past 18 months, David explained, pointing to different nodes on his diagram, there have been 17 major city contracts awarded to companies that have direct or indirect financial relationships with businesses in Marcus Whitfield's network. Planning commission approvals, zoning variances, construction permits, municipal service contracts. The pattern is consistent across multiple departments and multiple decision-making processes. Maya studied the diagram, trying to process the scope of what David was suggesting. This isn't just about facilitating meetings between corrupt officials and business interests. This is about systematically rigging the entire municipal contracting process. Exactly, David confirmed. And the beauty of using restaurants as the coordination point is that it provides perfect cover for what would otherwise be obviously suspicious activity. City council members need to eat lunch somewhere. Planning commissioners have dinner meetings. Construction company executives host client entertainment. All of that activity is completely normal and expected. He clicked to another screen that showed financial records from various municipal contracts. But when you track the timing of these meetings against the subsequent award of contracts, and when you follow the money through the network of companies that Marcus controls or influences, a clear pattern emerges. The restaurants aren't just venues. They're the operational headquarters for a systematic corruption network. Maya opened her portfolio and began pulling out the documentation she had organized the previous evening. As she spread her photographs and notes across the table, David's eyes lit up with the recognition of someone seeing puzzle pieces that would complete a larger picture. "This is incredible," he murmured, examining a photograph of the modified payment terminal. "I've been trying to figure out how they were processing payments that wouldn't leave standard banking records. This terminal setup would allow them to route transactions through alternative financial networks that don't report to federal oversight agencies." Maya pointed to another photograph that showed the coded reservation system. And this explains how they were coordinating the timing of meetings without creating obvious paper trails. The codes probably correspond to specific types of transactions or specific city departments. David was already taking notes, his pen moving rapidly across the legal pad. "Maya, this documentation is exactly what I needed to move from speculation to actionable reporting. With your insider knowledge of how the system operated, combined with the financial records I've been gathering, we can build a case that will be impossible for Marcus to dismiss or discredit." But as David spoke, Maya noticed movement outside the cafe window that made her stomach clench with sudden fear. A black sedan with tinted windows had pulled up across the street and two men in dark suits were sitting inside, their attention clearly focused on the bookstore. The vehicle was too expensive and too conspicuous for the neighborhood, and the men's behavior was too purposeful to be coincidental. "David," she said quietly, interrupting his explanation of legal procedures, "I think we're being watched." David followed her gaze to the sedan, his expression immediately shifting from excitement to concern. He closed his laptop and began gathering his papers with practiced efficiency. That didn't take long. "Marcus must have people monitoring your activities more closely than we anticipated." Maya felt a chill of real fear run through her. The abstract concept of retaliation was becoming concrete and immediate. What do we do? David stood up, slipping his laptop into a messenger bag. First, we leave separately. You go out the back exit and take public transportation home. Vary your route and make sure you're not being followed. I'll leave through the front and see if they follow me or stay focused on you." He handed her a small device that looked like a modified cell phone. "This can't be traced, in case you need to reach me." Then, as planned, Maya slipped through the back exit, and David walked towards the front calmly. The bus ride home to the circuitous path took twice as long, but gave her time to think about her choice. The black payment cards were not just an instrument, it was a symbol of a parallel banking economy that operated outside the regulations to fund large-scale corruption. The secure phone David had given her buzzed with an incoming message. "All your former colleagues are being questioned and monitored. Be careful about any communication with them." Maya felt the walls of the Whitfield empire closing in on her. Marcus wasn't simply intimidating her into silence, he was actively harassing her former colleagues within the restaurant. She thought about Sarah, thought who had always been supportive during difficult shifts, about Tom, who had covered for her when she was late, about new employee Jessica, who had just started a career in an industry that Maya now knew to be more dangerous and morally complex than she had ever imagined. Maya's secure device buzzed throughout the night with increasingly urgent messages from David. Each update painted a darker picture of the forces mobilizing against them. City officials were cancelling scheduled interviews. Former Meridian employees were receiving unexpected visits from people claiming to be conducting routine employment verification checks. Most disturbing of all, David's editor at the Seattle Tribune had received a call from the newspaper's legal department advising extreme caution in pursuing any stories related to the Whitfield restaurant group. The morning brought a message that changed everything. David had discovered that Marcus Whitfield's influence extended far beyond Seattle's city government. Federal contracts worth hundreds of millions of dollars had been awarded to companies within his network over the past 5 years. Defense Department catering services, federal building management contracts, and even diplomatic event coordination for visiting foreign dignitaries. What had started as a local corruption investigation was revealing itself as a national security concern. Maya dressed quickly and made her way to the new meeting location David had specified, a public library branch in a neighborhood she had never visited. The paranoia that had seemed excessive just days earlier now felt entirely justified. She varied her route, took multiple buses, and spent nearly an hour ensuring she wasn't being followed before finally arriving at the designated location. David was waiting in the periodical section, surrounded by newspapers and magazines, but clearly not reading any of them. His appearance had deteriorated noticeably since their first meeting. His clothes were wrinkled, his eyes were bloodshot from lack of sleep, and his usually calm demeanour had been replaced by barely controlled urgency. "Maya, thank you for coming," he said quietly as she sat down across from him. "We need to accelerate our timeline dramatically. I've learned that Marcus is planning to shut down several restaurant locations temporarily for what he's calling routine maintenance and system upgrades. That's going to eliminate access to the physical evidence we need and potentially destroy records that could prove our case." Maya felt her heart rate increase. "How much time do we have?" David glanced around nervously before responding. "The shutdowns begin Monday morning. Today is Friday. We have 3 days to gather everything we need and get this story published before the evidence disappears permanently." Maya Chen's story reminds us that courage isn't the absence of fear, but the willingness to act despite it. Sometimes the most ordinary people find themselves holding extraordinary power to expose truth and demand justice. Her mysterious encounter with a black card became the catalyst for unraveling corruption that reached the highest levels of power. If this story inspired you to never stop asking questions, please like this video and share it with someone who believes in standing up for what's right, no matter the cost.